Good evening. Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Michael Paris. I teach in the Political Science Department, and I'm the Program Director of our Legal Studies Institute. We are delighted to have with us a great scholar and author, Brettschneider of Brown University. And he's here to talk with us about this terrific new book, The Oath of the Office. The book will be for sale after the event, and the author will stay around and talk and sign books, and we're selling it at a significant discount. It's listed at $22.95, and you can buy it for $14 by check or credit card. So before I introduce Professor Brettschneider, I just want to say a quick word about our legal studies program. We have a minor in legal studies that's relatively new. We offer one-on-one pre-law advising for all students and graduates. It takes a lot of time, but it's worth it. We have workshops every semester on the law school admissions process, LSAT prep, how the process works. We connect people to the legal profession. A few weeks ago, we had this wonderful luncheon with judges and lawyers from Staten Island and 50 students, and it was just marvelous. We have several students going on to law school next year, some on full tuition scholarships, many with substantial awards to very good law schools, Fordham, Emory, Cardozo, and so on. And we also regularly sponsor public lectures like this one a year, sometimes one a semester. And if you're interested in knowing what we're doing and what events we're sponsoring, you can go to that URL, the csilsi.blogspot.com. It's a Google blog site. I don't blog, but I use it to convey information. And the beauty of that is you can go there and subscribe to it. So whenever I post anything, it'll go in your inbox. So if you're interested in keeping up with us, you can do that. Okay. Before I introduce the speaker, I have some people to thank for helping putting on this event. John Jankowski, the director of the center here, does a wonderful job, as you can see. We want to thank our co-sponsor, the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, Sheralta Takacs, who couldn't be here today. She's at a conference in California. I also want to thank my colleagues in legal studies, Mark White, the chair of the philosophy department, and Rich Flanagan, who I'll introduce later, is going to be doing some interviewing of Professor Brettschneider after the talk. And some of our adjuncts, Adam Silverlight, who's a Staten Island DA, and a new addition, Irene Avekit, who's the court attorney for the circuit court. Both of them teach with us and do a wonderful job. And finally, I want to acknowledge some important alums and friends who are with us today. Rashenda Kramer has been a supporter of what we do here and a benefactor, very generous with her time and her effort and her support. Her late husband, Dave Kramer, taught here for over 40 years, and we really stand on Dave's shoulders in what we do here. He's a wonderful guy, no mention. We always think about him when we think about trying to help our students. Yolanda Rudick is a graduate of the College of Staten Island, and she went on to Rutgers Law School and for over 2 decades headed up the Special Victims Unit of the Staten Island DA's office. You might know it as a sex crimes unit. And she's been very involved in the legal community and wonderfully supportive over many years. So thank you for being here and coming and continuing to support us. So thank you for your support. Is Michael Gervaisi here? Yeah, I don't know a lot of it, I'm sorry. Shook his hand earlier, so it's a little strange, but he's a new friend and supporter. We're going to be doing some important work together at New York High School. And he's not a CSI grad, but his spouse, Carol, is a CSI grad, and she's also the alumni board president. So thank you for coming and joining us and working with us. For all the students here who are eligible for extra credit or the clue credit, the sign-in sheets will be available in the back after the event. There'll be some refreshments, cookies and tea and soft drinks and whatnot after the event. Okay, so our topic today is the presidency of the Constitution. It is nothing if not timely, and we're delighted to have an important and accomplished scholar here to help us make sense of it. It's timely, but it's not exactly a new topic. You know, is the king answerable to the law of the land? Brettschneider is professor of political science and public policy at Brown University. where he teaches courses in political theory and public law. He is also currently a visiting professor at Fordham Law School, and in the past he's held visiting positions at the University of Chicago Law School and Harvard Law School. He received his PhD in politics from Princeton University and his JD from Stanford Law School, and he's the author of 2 previous books, When the State Speaks, What Should It Say? Princeton University Press, 2012, and Democratic Rights, also with Princeton, 2007. His very recent book, The Oath in the Office, is published by W.W. Norton. This is a terrific book, sweeping in its scope, depth in its indication of historical examples, and simply beautifully written. It was a great pleasure to read this. And again, we have copies if you want to purchase the book. I'm told that books are heavy and it costs a lot to ship them back, so please buy the book so we don't have to ship them and pay for the shipping. I didn't know that before now. I've never done book sales before. So Professor Brettschneider has agreed to spend some time answering your questions at the end of the talk and the interview, and also hanging out a little bit after to continue the conversation and sign books if you'd like. So please join me in welcoming to the College of Staten Island, Professor Corey Brettschneider.
Thank you, Michael, for that great introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming here today. Let me just start with just an observation as I try to look out into the crowd. My guess is that there's at least one person here, there are a lot of young people, who think to themselves, you know what? I could be President of the United States. You might think to yourself, these days it's a low bar, and I might be able to do a better job than what's happening now. So why would somebody want to be President of the United States? Let me just start with that simple question. For a lot of people, I think it's the grandeur, frankly. It's the appeal of Air Force One, of the White House. It might be the seeking of glory, going down in history as one of the greatest presidents. It might be other motives. It might be policy ambitions. We're facing a crisis of climate change, a crisis of poverty in this country, and you might think to yourself, as the most powerful person in the world, I could take care of those things. I'm going to talk some about those things, but I'm also going to present a very first and different view of the presidency, certainly not one that's about glory, but one that's broadly about restraint. And let me say something about this idea of the presidency. It comes from the oath of office. Article 1 of the Constitution, of course, creates the Congress and sets its powers, but also its limits. Article 2 creates the presidency, but also creates, in the powers granted, a set of limits on it. And Article 3, of course, the courts that are supposed to limit, in some cases, those other branches when they exceed those powers. The powers might be in the news a lot, but the limits should be more. And part of the argument of the book is that the way to figure out this sort of lost idea of the presidency is to look right into Article 2, which lays out the powers, but also the limits. And in particular, in Article 2, there is only one oath of office in the entire Constitution. It's found in Article 2. It defines what the president has to do the first few seconds in office. Word for word, the president has to say these things. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to, in a second, read it to you, and I want you to pay attention to the words. We hear it every 4 years. The president, by law, has to give the oath of office. It's so important, by the way, that when President Obama, as a result of Justice Roberts not reading carefully, didn't say the words exactly right, they had to redo it in the White House that night to make sure that he was, in fact, the president. In fact, people who work for President Obama say they were worried at that moment that maybe the president wasn't yet the president. So let's listen to it. This is a big, big deal. I'll read it very slowly, and so pay attention to it. Article 2 says that the president has to say exactly the following words. I do solemnly swear, you can also, according to the text, affirm, that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So what I'm going to do today is take seriously that commitment to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and the idea that that's the primary role of a legitimate president, is to regard the Constitution not just as something to not be violated, but as something to go beyond that, to promote it, to defend it, and to try to articulate a vision of it for the American people. Now, I was not, I will tell you, was very interested in going into politics at a young age and was not motivated by the constitutional conception of the presidency. When I'm talking about what reasons why people might want to be president, and I was one of those kids that at a young age wanted to be president, was motivated by something very different. So in the beginning of the book, I tell the following story. In Queens, which is where I grew up, there was one event that was the biggest event of the entire year, and that was the Queens Day Parade in Flushing Meadow Park, where, of course, the World's Fair was held. And I was walking behind the then mayor, Ed Koch, in this parade. My dad worked for a local politician, so this was the biggest moment in my life, being near my hero at the time, the mayor of the entire city of New York. And Koch, when he would walk, he'd throw his arms back and he'd say, "How am I doing? How am I doing?" to the crowd. And the crowd would shout back, and there I was, right under him, 10 years old, looking up. And this was an amazing moment, but it was also extremely hot. It was the middle of the summer. I was sweating. It was excruciating. And the mayor says to the politician next to him, "I'd really like some ice cream, vanilla." And the politician turns back and says to an aide who's next to me, "Get the man some ice cream." This grown man runs across Flushing Meadow Park, gets an ice cream cone, comes all the way back across the park, managing not to topple it, and hands the mayor an ice cream, and he's sitting there enjoying it as he's throwing his arms back and saying, "How am I doing?" And I thought to myself, you know what? I would like to be mayor of New York City. Now, I think for a lot of people, I think the current president might have been at this event. It really is the ice cream that's defining their reason to seek the presidency, their idea of the office, that they, have sort of attained the pinnacle and can do whatever it is that they wish to. But think of how different that idea of the presidency is from the original one. And I'm going to go all the way back to the second inaugural and read to you the second inaugural address. Don't worry, it won't drone on. It's 135 words, the shortest ever given. This is George Washington. And at the time, inaugurals weren't given to the public at large. This is given to members of Congress, really, just to about the number of people who are in this room, room actually smaller on the second floor in Philadelphia, what's now Independence Park. You could go to the old Senate chamber, and I'd say about maybe a third the size of this room. He reads the following words. It defines the vision of the presidency that I'm going to try to defend today. He says, previous to the execution of any official act of the president, the Constitution requires an oath of office. This oath I am about to take, and in your presence, that if it shall be found during my administration of the government that I have in any instance violated willingly or knowingly the injunctions therein, I may, besides incurring constitutional punishment, be subject to the upbraidings of all those who are witness at the present solemn ceremony. Think of how different those words are. The President of the United States, the first president, is looking out to the crowd and saying, look, I've just taken the oath of office, but if I violate it, what I want you to do, the people who are here assembled before me, is to stop me. Subject me to constitutional punishment. We'll talk about what that might mean. Certainly it includes impeachment, but it also includes other things. And certainly criticize me. And the vision of the presidency in those few words, what it does is it separates the person, George Washington, from the office, the idea of the presidency itself. And the suggestion is that this thing, the office, is so important that if I, George Washington, violate it, I am beneath the office. I am not the office. Subject me, stop me. That is your constitutional duty if I do wrong. Of course, Washington thought he wouldn't do wrong, but that setup is going to be fundamental. So I'm going to talk about the obligations of a president, what a president needs to do to respect the oath of office, and then I'm going to talk about an issue that couldn't be more salient for the moment that we're in now, which is what do you do when a president disregards the oath? How do you stop such a president, not just through the obvious means of constitutional punishment, but through others as well. This Washingtonian idea of the presidency couldn't be more different in many ways from the modern presidency. We've strayed from it. And it really begins with Woodrow Wilson, where things, frankly, in my view, go wrong. And I'll say something about Wilson. Wilson was probably the greatest constitutional scholar of his time, and he sought to expand the office of the president to make it a much more powerful office, not to be a co-equal branch, but really a first among equals. And one of the things that he does is he takes the idea of the bully pulpit, created by Teddy Roosevelt, the idea of a press office that would rally the American people to put pressure on Congress to pass legislation, and therefore to use the sort of voice of the president as the solely elected person on behalf of all the American people to get legislation passed. But what does he do with that bully pulpit? He invites for a screening in the White House the film Birth of a Nation, which is a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan, the opponents of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, arguably the most important amendment of the entire Constitution. And that's widely known at this point. There were protests, for instance, at Princeton over it. But what isn't, unfortunately, as well known is the fact that it's not just that he shows the film in the White House, but it's that he's quoted at length in it, that in his works he had defended the Ku Klux Klan, despite their, again, opposition, and the Klan is founded in opposition to the idea of equality under law passed after the Civil War. And rather than apologize for it, he highlights the fact that he's quoted here by showing it in the White House. Now, what's significant for me is that at the same time you have an expansion of the presidency, you have a violation of the duty of the President of the United States to use all of the presidential powers, including the bully pulpit, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, that obligation of a president to use the bully pulpit in defense of the Constitution isn't just violated by Wilson, but it actually becomes more salient, more important as the 20th century moves on. The First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the freedom of speech, and that has meant in the modern era the right to criticize presidents and even to criticize our constitutional system of government. That wasn't always the case. There were presidents very early on who disregarded that obligation of a president to protect free speech. John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which allowed for the prosecution of anyone who disparaged the President of the United States. Now, the acts are written in a way so that it's illegal to criticize the President, but perfectly legal to criticize the Vice President. Now, I see some people laughing because you know the Vice President at the time is Thomas Jefferson, a member of the opposition party. This is a purely partisan piece of legislation meant to empower the President of the United States to prosecute political opponents. And he does that. He orders his Attorney General to try to send newspaper editors who mock him, who criticize him, to prison, and undermines the idea of free speech. So this early president, far from defending this constitutional obligation to protect free speech, to allow criticism or invite it, does the opposite. But in the 20th century, we have a very different way of thinking about free speech. Alexander Meiklejohn, the great free speech theorist, says, imagine that all of us are in a town meeting right now as a metaphor for American democracy. And imagine that the moderator in the meeting starts to pick and choose who's allowed to speak based on the opinion, based on whether or not they're pro or against a particular policy position. So imagine this isn't Meiklejohn's example, it's mine. We're debating in our town meeting. Do we build a bridge on the north side of town or the south side of town? And now imagine further that the moderator decides that those who speak in favor of the north side of town are just confused and are silly in their views and starts to ban those people from speaking. Meiklejohn's point is that in a democracy, we have to be free to hear all viewpoints, to make our own decisions, or we're not really democratic citizens. And so things like the Alien Sedition Act don't just limit our expression, they limit our ability as citizens to freely decide in a democracy who we want to elect and what we want to believe. Now, Now, that view becomes prevalent in the 20th century, such that the modern Supreme Court has said that if you have a political opinion, it cannot be banned by criminal law. Viewpoints cannot simply be banned by criminal law. And what that means is that people who want to criticize from the left the Constitution of the United States have a right to do so. And it has also meant, and this is going to bring me to the tie back to the bully pulpit, it also means that short of threats, you can't threaten anyone, so a cross burned on the lawn of an African-American family can be construed as a threat and banned by law. But the Ku Klux Klan can burn a cross on the open field. But that makes it all the more important that a president use the bully pulpit to, yes, defend free speech, unlike Adams, but also to criticize some viewpoints that threaten the very ideals of the Constitution. And so Wilson's failure becomes even more important in an era in which speech is protected for opponents of the Constitution, including groups like the Ku Klux Klan, or as the Supreme Court said when the Nazis marched in Skokie, them as well. Modern presidents sometimes have risen to the challenge. Think of after 9/11, when the second President Bush could have played to elements of his constituency and stirred up anti-Muslim sentiment, but instead he says Islam is a religion of peace. Or think of Barack Obama's response, excellent response, when there is a film made disparaging Islam on the west coast of California. He sends and has advertisements made that are broadcast throughout the Muslim world outside the United States that say the following thing: we protect this video and these abhorrent views as a matter of constitutional law, but only because our Constitution requires it and our democracy requires it. And at the same time that we protect it, I, on behalf of the American people, condemn the attack and disparagement on Islam. So these two examples, unlike Wilson, are an example of how a president can protect free speech, yes, but also defend the Constitution using the bully pulpit. Protect the idea of free speech under the First Amendment, and also the idea that we are equal under law enshrined in the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Sometimes, as in the case of free speech, courts will help. I think courts would strike down a modern Alien and Sedition Act, although an opinion by Justice Thomas said that he might not agree with that. I think there are 8 votes for that. But sometimes presidents really do have to go beyond what courts are going to do, and courts, frankly, in the modern world, are not going to be completely reliable in protecting the Constitution. On the matter of torture and whether or not suspected terrorists can be tortured, Justice Scalia argued that they do not have 8th Amendment rights against cruel and unusual punishment when it comes to torture. That punishment refers to punishment after a trial and conviction, but extraction of information is not torture because there has been no formal conviction and no formal punishment. I think that is deeply wrong, and I argue so in the book. It rests on an interpretation of the Constitution that ignores the deeper values of the Constitution and looks only at its text. And on my view, you need to look behind the words to get the ideas and their history. And the history of the 8th Amendment is a response to kings in England who had been torturing subjects in order to get them to submit and using unusual punishments like ear chopping. And the British Bill of Rights uses the language of banning cruel and unusual punishment. And when it's transformed into the American Constitution, it's meant exactly to limit the tendencies of an absolute monarch or of a president who might move in those directions. So when President Trump said that he would torture the families of suspected terrorists, that's a violation not just of due process, but also clearly of the 8th Amendment. And when he says after Charlottesville that he thinks there are good people on both sides, the Nazis and anti-Nazi side, that to me is also a violation of the bully pulpit. Although courts are not going to guarantee that, it's got to be the task of citizens to start to see that the Constitution is something that when we vote, when we talk about who we are going to vote for, that we start to defend, because courts will do neither of those Now, in the travel ban case, which I'll come to, in the question of the Equal Protection Clause, see how we're moving through. We started with Article 2. We talked about the bully pulpit, the First Amendment, the Eighth Amendment. Now I want to say something about the 14th Amendment and its guarantee of equal protection of law. And before I say something about the travel ban, I want to tell you the story of Che Champing. Che Champing is a resident of San Francisco, and he goes home to China. He's a property owner in San Francisco. He goes home to China. He gets from the Customs House permission to re-enter the country. This is in the late 19th century, the late 1800s. To re-enter the country after he takes care of some personal business at home. And in between, as he's coming back from China, Congress passes and the president signs the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring all Chinese immigration. And Che Champing says a very simple thing. Under the Constitution, I have the right to come back in. I have due process rights. He could have added that I have equal protection rights. For a variety of reasons, he didn't make that argument, but he certainly could have. And the court, in rejecting Che Champing's claim, says the following thing, that in our Constitution, constitutional rights are only inside the country. They don't extend to people outside the country. But on my view, that view changed since the 19th century in Brown versus Board of Education, in a case involving the right of non-citizens to go to public schools. And the evolution of the 20th century is about the idea that no branch of government can violate the idea of equal protection of law. And so a Chinese Exclusion Act is unconstitutional because it is based on animus, based on ethnicity or national origin. And so when President Trump signed an executive order banning travel from several Muslim countries, and when he said that his reason for doing so, both during the campaign and after, was to a complete and total shutdown of Muslim immigration, I, like many others, thought it was unconstitutional, and I was in a position to draft a brief that scholars signed saying this is a clear indication of an unconstitutional act by a president, and moreover, this is the time to repudiate the holding of Che Champing, to reverse it. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, 4 justices agreed with me, and the brief was cited by Justice Sotomayor in the dissent. 4 disagreed, and a 5th justice, Justice Kennedy, couldn't quite decide. He thought that we needed more evidence, and he voted with the majority to uphold the travel ban. But that is an example of where courts should have acted. Certainly that, to me, instance is a clearly unconstitutional act by a president disregarding the oath. But the fact is the courts did not act, putting more pressure on all of us to find ways outside the courts of defending the Constitution, of holding, as George Washington asked, a president up to the oath of office. So what can we do, absent courts, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States? Certainly, I think the 2020 election has to be a referendum on the Constitution. That is a first place for us to act. But there are others as well. That Alien and Sedition Act that I mentioned was resisted by Thomas Jefferson, the sitting vice president, and James Madison, the person who had done the most to craft the Constitution and to write most of the Bill of Rights, by going back to their home state of Virginia and drafting resolutions that say this act is unconstitutional and we're not going to cooperate with the federal government when it comes to imprisoning people who criticize John Adams. And in the book, I profile a modern-day hero resisting modern-day injustices. Miguel Marquez is a former judge, now the head of Santa Clara County and the deviser of its legal strategy, resisting Donald Trump's executive order saying that sanctuary cities that refuse to cooperate with ICE in their attempt to demand that local government hold without warrants, without cause, 72 hours suspected undocumented people. When they refuse to do that, Marquez says we're using the 10th Amendment, the right of states to resist illegal and unconstitutional federal policy. And I say why that's in the tradition of Madison and Jefferson. Let's get to the meat of the issue that everyone is talking about. Can you indict a sitting president? Of course, one way to stop a president would be to imprison a president who committed illegal criminal acts. The framers, frankly, disagreed about this question. Hamilton said impeachment has to come first. You can't indict a sitting president. Only after impeachment by by more than 50% of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, procedure that has to take place before indictment, and after the president is removed, then he or she can be indicted. But I, in the book, am with James Wilson, who said something very simple. A president is not above the law. And that's an idea that our case law in the modern era has repeated again and again. U.S. v. Nixon, demanding that Nixon, because he is not above the law, has to comply with a criminal subpoena in a criminal case in which he was an unindicted co-conspirator. Clinton v. Jones, saying that civil litigation can proceed against the sitting president of the United States. There are two memos in the Justice Department written during Nixon and Clinton that say otherwise. They say, first of all, the president is too busy. In response to that, I say, well, in the Clinton case, they've worked it out schedule-wise. The president can fly around the world moving the nuclear suitcase. His office can work out how to get him to court. I don't think that's much of an argument. More importantly, the idea of dignity, the claim in the memos, is that presidents are too dignified to be indicted while in office. And here I cite the second inaugural that I began with. A president's dignity rests on his or her compliance with the oath of office. But the office is not the person. And when an individual breaks the oath of office, the obligation of those defending the office is to subject a president to constitutional punishment. And yes, I include in that not just impeachment, but also the possibility of criminal indictment of a sitting president. Let me end with the other question on people's mind, impeachment. I'm not going to talk about the strategy here of what to do or not to do, but I do want to say this, that the hero of my book, in the end, in this last chapter on impeachment, which we built to the ultimate, in many ways, constitutional punishment that Washington is referencing, is Frederick Douglass. And let me tell you what he says. He is talking about the impeachment, pending impeachment of the first President Johnson, Andrew Johnson. And there's a device, a legal maneuver that's being made by the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate that focuses on his supposedly illegal firing of the Secretary of War. And what Frederick Douglass says is, come on, this is not a legal procedure. That's a criminal justice procedure, maybe, that exists separately from us. But when the House is going to impeach somebody, it does so for moral reasons, to do with the oath of office. And in the case of Andrew Johnson, what Douglass said is, this man is traveling around the country, giving the most vile racist speeches, and when you read them, frankly, they would make Donald Trump blush. They are that beyond the pale. And more than that, he is refusing to enforce the 13th Amendment, ending slavery. He is basically using these speeches to rally America to return to an era before the Civil War, to undo the gains that had been made so recently, and to return, if not formally, informally, to a system of slavery. And Douglass's point is that is enough for impeachment, because impeachment is about the oath, not about the criminal law, a different matter. So I'll leave you with that thought. I'm going to look forward to the conversation. There's a lot to talk about, and I'll just recap the following. We began with this idea of the words of the oath of office. I asked you to listen to them very carefully. The commitment to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and I gave you Washington's second inaugural as an example of why that oath means that if a president fails to do so, they have to be subject to constitutional punishment. I showed you a president who deeply strayed from that oath in the use of the modern bully pulpit. That's Woodrow Wilson. That's also Adams and the Alien Sedition Acts. And I talked about why the obligation of a president is to not just not violate the Constitution when courts require it, but even when they're not policing, to defend the Constitution through the bully pulpit at the same time as defending free speech. I talked about the Eighth Amendment. Courts are certainly not going to stop a president from torturing. I believe that, unfortunately, Scalia's view prevails on the modern Supreme Court, but it is the wrong view, and presidents should go beyond what the court requires and actually defend that entitlement enshrined in the Eighth Amendment by never torturing and opposing any torture in the United States. I talked about Che Jianping and that terrible Chinese Exclusion Act and why it is also an Eighth Amendment, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, and why courts should have struck down Donald Trump's travel ban, but they didn't, putting pressure even more on all of us to vote in the 2020 election based on a defense of the Constitution. And then I ended with indictment, of course, and the role of the states in resisting tyranny, and finally, Frederick Douglass on impeachment. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, well, you gotta turn the mics on and get situated there. Rich Flanagan is the chair of the Political Science Department, author of 3 books on university politics.
Thanks, Mike. That's plenty.
Wonderful guy.
That's too much.
I love him to death.
And
so I'm gonna hand it over, and let's say maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, not even, right?
I'm going to take this mic with me.
I'm sure there's lots of questions out there. I can smell it.
Okay, terrific.
All right. Well, I'll get the party started with questions. I very much enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
I would, in terms of moving some copies outside, I would say that a lot of great points, and each point was really unpacked with a story, and many of them I didn't know at all. So I really recommend the book. So I guess the orange elephant in the room is the book itself doesn't talk all that much about Trump, and yet you took on this project in the era of Trump. So how much of this book is a response to the Trump administration?
I had been working on other things, but when Donald Trump ran for office, I dropped basically everything and started to write only about him. And so these also were pieces not for academic audiences, but I had a piece in Politico called Trump versus the Constitution, and the subtitle was a guide. And what I did is I went through each of the proposals that Donald Trump was making on the campaign trail and showed why it was really a proposal to violate the Constitution of the United States. When he proposed torturing not the suspected terrorists, but the families of suspected terrorists, I went through and talked about why that was a violation of due process and also the Eighth Amendment. When he proposed, as he did, a complete and total shutdown of Muslim immigration into the United States until we know, in his words, what is going on, I talked about why that's a violation of equal protection and also of the Establishment Clause. And it really went point by point to try to talk to America about why this is not a normal proposal, a normal politician, and why it's really an assault on our core values, our democratic values, and also the text of the Constitution. But I guess my thought was, I could have done a book that just expanded that article. You can still read that article online. But I thought we've got to think, this isn't just one president. It's not just one moment. There's a danger that this could happen again. And I still continue to think that because he's made good on these proposals. And we need to think about the office. And so that's why it's written that way. It is about Trump in its origin, but it's also an attempt to really reclaim what's gone wrong in this moment and to be ready for future moments where it might happen again.
And well, to that point then, let's think back to the last 50 years of U.S. history. Who do you think, on balance, and you have criticisms of practically everybody in the lineup, but who do you think, on balance, is the most constitutionally minded president of the modern era? Let's say the past 60.
Historically, I go back to Washington, of course, in the book, but one challenge is, can modern presidents do it? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I would put it in 2 places that people might not think come to mind, and I give them a tie for modern presidents. One is Eisenhower. Now, why is that? A couple of reasons. In the Little Rock controversy, of course, President Eisenhower is faced with a governor who he tries to negotiate with to agree to a court order to integrate Little Rock schools, and he refuses to do so. Eisenhower is, despite his tendency towards moderation and compromise, after trying to compromise, realizes, what, I need to back up this court, and he nationalizes, of course, the Guard, and through force, really integrates the schools. And also, he does a second thing that I think is fundamental. He preserves the New Deal. The New Deal was seen as a very, partisan piece of legislation, and to me, it's a new constitutional moment showing that rights aren't just rights against the state, but there's a role of government in guaranteeing freedom from want, as Roosevelt says, and so he preserves that. He preserves Social Security and takes it as being partisan. I guess too, the other president, maybe I'll give Johnson an edge. Of course, there's Vietnam, which we can talk about, but the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act really do as much as the 13th and 14th Amendment to bring, certainly don't succeed in ending discrimination anyway, but they move us on the march towards equality more than really any other president. Mm-hmm. And what these modern presidents are doing is not just acting in a restrained way, but they're acting through constitutional means, through legislation, through the enforcement of court orders to guarantee the Constitution. And so, yeah, I'll give it to those two.
Okay. So, arguing that presidents should have a measure of self-restraint when thinking about constitutional issues. And I guess that would lead to two sorts of questions. The first one is this at all realistic, considering the pressures of the office? That is to say, shouldn't it be enough to rely on separation of powers or other mechanistic restraints rather than going back to Washington and Washington laying out an argument for something more, something about virtue? Is it really realistic to hope that a president can be self-restrained?
I think it's not going to just happen magically. I think the tendency of the office is an increase in power and the sort of vision of the presidency that I began with. But I think that there are things that we can do to make sure that presidents start to become more constitutional in their commitments. Part of it is the demand from voters. And so the reason why I've written a book, not for academics, but in an attempt to talk to people more widely, is to try to get this on the agenda as something that we care about as we address the president. I think presidents care about greatness, and so the disgrace of Donald Trump and pointing that out as often as I can, and not just me, of course, but the consensus view, I think, among historians, political scientists, constitutional law professors, that this is a disastrous presidency. But that's also an incentive for presidents to care about this and to see how it can go so deeply wrong. And I also just don't think there's another alternative, because the idea of separation of powers where we just sort of trust the court isn't going to work in the modern era. So I think this is really the best we've got.
Okay, that notion of greatness. It may be a pivot point to change the culture.
Yes.
Maybe they can internalize a sense of what makes a president great.
Yeah, and Donald Trump's got that all wrong.
Too often it's been about programmatic advancement with no sense of due process.
Yeah.
Those sorts of norms. One might argue that you're reading a certain timeless construction of the Constitution. I mean, you're very tough on President Wilson, who's clearly racist in his attitudes. But I wonder if it's asking too much of him and other historical figures to essentially adopt the modern Constitution in their thinking. I mean, it seems like you're holding Wilson to a standard, a post-civil rights 1960s standard. And are you arguing that there's an essential Constitution that transcends time that all presidents should be able to interpret?
Yeah, I mean, Wilson himself was the originator of the idea of a living Constitution, and you'll notice, as you did, just pointed out, that that's not the language that I use. I think of the Constitution, and I have in common with Scalia and originalists the idea that there is not multiple constitutions, there's one, framed by the text. But where I depart from him is I think that text enshrines a set of values that are timeless, and that's what I'm getting to. And in the case of Wilson, I guess I would say he certainly knew better. He was a constitutional law professor. He had read Justice Harlan's dissent in the Plessy case. He had read Harlan in the civil rights cases. He knew the arguments on the other side, and he was an extremist even for his own time, certainly. He wasn't just pro-segregation, although I would criticize him for that. He was pro-Ku Klux Klan. Organization founded, as I said, in opposition to the idea that under law we are equal. They don't even pretend to buy into Plessy, and yet he's a really in a worse way to his to racist elements of his southern constituency. That's part of why he's doing it, but yet in his scholarly work before he was doing that, he was doing it as well. So no, I think he absolutely deserves to be condemned. Yeah.
And just briefly to consider maybe critiques of your work from the left and the right. A left critique may be that there's a little bit of a constitutional veneration when we need constitutional change. And one thinks of perhaps eliminating the electoral college as an example of that. How do you respond to critics on the left who may say that we need a more democratic institution?
Yeah, that's great. And there's I would call a left magazine called The Point, which I recommend. And I just did a long interview with one of the interviewers there, really pushing me on that point. And this is why I said there, and I could give a short version here, which is, nothing about believing in the Constitution and its values, which is really what I'm defending, and the Bill of Rights in particular, requires that every single aspect of the Constitution that we have to buy into. And I think the Electoral College, I've been reading very carefully through the Constitutional Convention. They have an idea that they're trying to get across, which is the protection of minorities. That's what they're trying to do, and to avoid a sort of populist president. And I think that they would certainly respond to the argument that after historically seeing what happens, that this thing is not functional. So certainly I think we can should change the Electoral College and switch to a majoritarian system and still respect and defend the values of the Constitution. In fact, I think it's the reason to do it.
And a critique from the right might be that what doesn't come up in your book, which is concerns about liberty, economic liberty, really, and the overreach of the courts and Congress into contracts. How do you think? Well, and perhaps you've had conversations already. What's been the conservative response to your book, along with that sort of libertarian conservative dimension?
Yeah, I mean, there is a sort of revival of the Lochner idea that Roosevelt, as I said, changes, that the Constitution is really primarily about property protection. And I guess my response to that is I think that's wrong. I think the Lochner era, that period of time, that history is an aberration that happens in the early 20th century, really between about 1900 and 1936, where the court's just gone wrong. It's really strayed from the values of the Constitution. Things are not right because the Supreme Court says it. The Constitution is independent of any one opinion and any one court, and that is an example of a tragically misguided court. And Roosevelt can be criticized for his threat to pack the court, but what he was trying to do, and eventually did, is to set the court on a more proper path when it comes to constitutional interpretation. So libertarians don't agree with that. I think they think that, some of them anyway, think that court was well within its rights and that it was interpreting the Constitution the right way. Another not libertarian critique, but maybe related, is originalism, the idea that it's not about the values, it's just about the text. And there, I think, that's not how the framers read it. That's not how George Washington read it. That's not how the document was conceived. It's not its intent. And so I'm very critical also of that very textual way of reading the Constitution.
And I guess, one thing that occurred to me, this is quite hectic. You make mention of the importance of the White House counsel in serving the president. Could that office be subject to Senate approval? I mean, would that require a statutory change or constitutional change if we said you can pick your White House counsel, Mr. President, but you have to run it by the Senate first?
There'd be a challenge based on the idea that high-level, purely executive offices are under complete control of the president, and that view is called the unitary executive. It was later expanded into international relations by John Yoo, but that's its original meaning. So there might be a constitutional challenge to it. But I think the thing that's more important than the White House counsel, because to me those are really just advisors, and so I don't care that much what that office is saying, and I don't necessarily need. I wouldn't mind Senate approval, but that's not where I think the action is. I think what we really need is a return to the independent counsel law of the Ken Starr variety, which would protect a counsel that was looking into criminal wrongdoing by a president. And when the Ken Starr investigation, President Clinton didn't like that he was looking into him, and didn't like the fact that this very conservative man also defended the idea the best articles about why sitting presidents can be indicted. And what allowed them to do that was the protection that the Congress had given them. So I'm very much in favor of speaking in favor of a bill to protect the Mueller investigation. Right now, I don't see anything to prevent Trump from firing Mueller who is Attorney General, or even trying to do it directly. There are administrative regulations that can be revoked. But what would protect them is a bill passed by both houses and subject to a veto but also an override that would guarantee that office, or a return to the old independent counsel law where that person investigating the president doesn't work for the president. But we're in a dire circumstance right now. I mean, the person who is in charge of telling us whether or not the president of the United States committed a crime works for the president, and that is a messed up situation.
Sure, sure. Should we?
Yeah, let's open it up. So let's see. If I can figure out.
The mic, okay. We're going to open it up. Again, thank you all for coming. And we just have another round of applause for and I usually include a little pitch about at a university, all views are welcome. Obviously, our speaker has a point of view, and that is as it should be. But you can have a point of view, and you can have it and articulate it and not worry, because it's a university, so all views are welcome. Anybody want to ask a question? Okay. State your name and then your question, and try to be brief. You can make a statement, but try to be brief.
First of all, thank you for coming, Corey. Brettschneider. The first question, it's kind of tied between, but at your time at Princeton and Stanford University, how did attending those schools nurture those your beliefs of presidency, especially Princeton, seeing as the Woodrow Wilson School, Public Affairs School, is really closely tied together with those values and everything. How did that affect you?
I just didn't know the history at the time, and I don't think most people did. I don't even think President Eisgruber at the time knew it. And he was and was venerated on campus. The School of Public Policy is named after him. The faculty club is in his house, and people celebrated that. But I think it's an obligation of all of us, to be honest, when you learn things about somebody that suggests that, far from being one of our greatest presidents, I think he was one of our worst. It doesn't take away from his efforts in international affairs. I think we can acknowledge that. But I worry about celebrating him, and I certainly wouldn't advocate, naming things after him or celebrating him.
Questions? I didn't have to move.
Yeah, my name is Sammy Corrado. Thank you again, Corey Brettschneider. I appreciate you coming here, like everyone else. So my question is when it comes to the time of the period of time and then the presidency, you said something about morals. Do you think that morals change over time, and do you think that do you think there is a core set of principles and morals that we will always have? Or do you think that no matter what, our morals will always change over time? And how much do you think it affects it? And do you think our morals from before affects it, our changed outcomes now compared to before?
I do think that certainly, as a matter of fact, ideas evolve and understanding of scientific fact has changed since the 18th century. But what I'm saying in the book is that the text of the Constitution, which remains our Constitution, and not just the 18th century Constitution, but for me, as important, maybe more important, are the post-Civil War amendments, the 13th Amendment, and ending the idea of property ownership in people, ending the idea of subordination, not just ownership in people, guaranteeing equal protection of the law, applying the Bill of Rights to the states and as a matter of individual rights, not just limits on the federal government, and then also that 15th Amendment and its guarantee of equal voting. Those values, combined with the Bill of Rights and the limited presidency, aren't just any values, they're the right ones. And they're the ones I think that we need to look to in difficult times. Those values are at odds with the interpretation that many people gave to them. So many people in the founding Not all of them, certainly not Benjamin Rush, and I don't believe Madison was certainly a hypocrite, owned enslaved people, but also believed it was wrong. That tension between practices and the values, that's what we need to bring out in constitutional law. So, Che Champing, the belief that you can exclude people based on their Chinese heritage, is at odds with that equal protection clause. Now, did people know that in the 19th century? Did that court know it? Some did, but the majority didn't. I think the role of courts, of citizens, is to try to iron these things out, to take our best values, including the value in the Declaration itself, that all people are created equal, uses the word man, but it's rightly interpreted, of course, as all people, and apply them to the circumstances on the ground. And there are enormous resources within the Constitution to do that. We don't have to throw out the whole thing. Look at our president, frankly, his lawlessness. And what's the best response? To me, it's that second inaugural address and the values that are enshrined.
Okay.
Hi, Professor Andrew Rosori. Thank you for coming. So I think Professor Flanagan alluded to the fact of, the separation of powers, and you yourself with the independent counsel. And I understand the argument for the president restraining himself, and the court system is, of course, it's a complicated way to strike down the president. But can't you make the argument at least that Congress is really the one failing to uphold their, they can very easily tomorrow pass the bill, like you said, to protect Mueller. They can override a veto anytime they choose, whereas the court, obviously, you have to go through the system. So would you make the argument that we're looking for more self-restraint, or is it the Congress itself that's violating their role?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see in the book, I was going to say if you buy it or when you buy it, that I take a three-branch approach. And my idea is that the Constitution is independent of any one branch, and all three branches take oaths. The president, especially, required by Article 2. But members of Congress, if you watched recently, took oaths, recently elected members, to uphold the Constitution and the judiciary, of course. And so in the book, I really talk about the obligations of all three branches, certainly the presidency, and not just the need for a new independent counsel law or the Protect Mueller bill. I discuss that. But in matters of war powers, it's an example of where the Congress has gone so wrong. The Constitution gives the president the power of commander-in-chief, yes, but it's Congress that declares or initiates war. And yet, through the War Powers Act, they've essentially given up that power. They've delegated it to the president for 30 or 60 days. And after 30 or 60 days, frankly, of a president engaging in armed conflict abroad, the idea that the Congress is going to step in and say no is absurd. And the War Powers Act was extremely well-intentioned, but it's been a failure. And so I say we need a new War Powers Act to reclaim Congress's requirement that they initiate war. From day one, there should be no time limit. That's how I think about it. So a friend of mine says, we're in heated agreement. And yes, there's an oath of the president, but also of the other two branches. But we have to be prepared for the fact that all three, in some instances in American history, maybe all three branches will do their job. And we've had periods of history like that, but we're not in one now. And so as one fails, the others have to pick up. So in the current moment of Trump, who really has, as much as any president, probably more, in my estimation, disregarded the oath of office. You asked about the best. I make a, we're 4 years in. This is, I think, the worst constitutional president because he combines elements of all of the other presidents that have undermined the Constitution. He does it all. And that's a role of courts, which have totally failed in their obligation in the travel ban case. There is the emergency declaration case. I'm optimistic that will be 5-4 and that Justice Roberts will do the right thing and say, as I say in the book, that this is a violation of Congress's power to allocate resources and to make law, and the president has usurped them, abusing this piece of legislation meant to rein in a president. So I'm optimistic that the courts will do their job. Congress has started to do its job in that case. They did vote, majority of the House and of the Senate, to stop this emergency. The president, of course, vetoed it. But we're at a difficult moment where one branch has really failed. And so there are these moments of hoping that the other branches will step up. And we have to do everything we can to put pressure on them to make sure that they do it.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I have to ask a question.
Sure.
What if I said that President Obama failed in many respects and liberals fail in failing to take seriously the aggrandizement of presidential power when he disregarded the War Powers Resolution in Libya?
I say that in the book.
I know, I'm referencing the book, but I don't think you're tough enough on Obama and tough enough on liberals for acquiescing or executive orders that are really lawmaking.
Yeah, and you know what? I embrace that criticism because I think that myself included, there was a mentality before Trump of thinking, you know, when it's a good president, we don't have to worry that much. And that's a terrible mistake. And so when we look at these Democratic candidates and we evaluate them, if there's a candidate who says, you know what, I'm going to use an emergency declaration to end poverty, or I'm going to use an emergency declaration even to resolve the problem of climate change, you need to be skeptical. Because that's the same thing that Trump is saying. I know the issues are different. I'm more sympathetic to those goals. But it's essential that we recover the idea of the rule of law, not just for presidents that we don't agree with on their policies, but for all presidents going forward. So, yeah, I think that's a good example, a Libya example that I bring out in the book, and I could have spent more time on it. But, you know, Obama also should have known better. He was a constitutional law professor at the University of Chicago. He knew that what he was doing was problematic. And I would add to what you said, the problem with drone strikes, which many of us fail to really say, you know, this is a violation of the idea of due process. Yes, you can get away with it because of Che Champagne, but that's a terrible case. You don't want to rely on it.
And I wanted to add, failing to name and advocate holding accountable criminally people who torture.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
you would, okay, that's a failure as well.
Yeah, no question.
I think we'll take one more question. And then there is maybe two more questions quickly. There's some refreshments and books, and you sign your papers. We're almost done. So a couple more questions.
Hi. Thank you for coming. I'm Jace. I just wonder why constitutionally this presidency at the moment is considered legitimate, if only because there was foreign influence. And if somebody were to agree to that, though, what could possibly be said or done about it? Whether I agree or disagree, one thing or another, but what would that kind of implementation of the Constitution look like?
I mean, I think I ended with this, and I guess I'll just be more blunt. I was being kind of like the book, being a little coy. You know, I think if the Mueller report reveals, and if he doesn't release the report, Congress certainly needs to subpoena it and can constitutionally. If it reveals that there was this collaboration with a foreign government, with Russia, in influencing the election, then he needs to be, in my view, first of all, prosecuted under the criminal statutes that are relevant. Mueller should do that. If he doesn't do it, I think it is up to the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, to do it. This is our state. You can write to her, and she has the ability to do it if Mueller fails to do it. She'll have to make that constitutional argument that I've been making, but I think she would be on strong grounds. I just did an event with Zephyr Teachout, who lost that election, but she said she did believe that she had the power to indict and that she had the evidence she was going to do it. So I want to see Letitia James do that in the absence of Mueller if he believes these memos bind him. I don't think they do, but if he believes that, that's the other route, most direct one. And of course, the other one, also relevant to New York, Congressman Nadler is the head of the Judiciary Committee. And if there's a failure to indict the president for those crimes, they're clearly high crimes and misdemeanors, in addition to the other things that I've mentioned. And the right way forward, after we have the report, is, I think, impeachment and removal. And those are the two processes that are outlined in the Constitution. Washington is referencing them. And if that's, you know, it's a big if, but if it's in there, and there's good evidence to think it is, that's the way forward.
Okay, one more question.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Ben. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
You mentioned multiple times the Eighth Amendment as an example of abuse of the Constitution and Justice Scalia's interpretation of investor torture and Trump's comments on them. Do you believe there's a difference in the actions and speech of a president?
Say it again. Sorry. Say just a little more about what the question is.
the speech and actions of the president. So the president says he would do something, but said doesn't. Yeah.
Right, so maybe Trump, I think that is a good question. So say it was just campaign rhetoric and then he didn't do it. And actually that was the argument in the travel ban case, that this was just campaign rhetoric and that this policy of the travel ban was totally disconnected from what he was saying. To me, Justice Kennedy, despite his vote and failure to act the way he should have, said the following thing in the oral argument. I attended that oral argument. I was very enthused by what Justice Kennedy said. He said, imagine there's a mayor of a town who says something the day before the election, campaign promise that's clearly unconstitutional, and then is elected the next day after saying it, and the next day after that implements the policy. Does it matter that it was a campaign? And his point was, no, of course not. We can see the clear link. So the torture we don't know about, frankly. We don't have transparency. My worry is that that is happening. We do know in the travel ban. And, you know, that's a place where courts fail to act, but the rest of us need to, at minimum, act in the election, I think, frankly, and also it's a place for Congress, I think, to also consider. One of the articles of impeachment, on my view, should deal with that deeply unconstitutional policy to the attempt to shut down all Muslim immigration.
Okay, thank you so much, Corey Brettschneider. So,
and thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to talking to all of you. I'm going to sign books in the back. Got your Sharpie? Okay. Thank you. Okay, thanks.